Good day, scholars. It's science time with Mr. Alan, and I'm glad to walk you through the topic of today, which is evolution part 2. We are learning to investigate examples of natural selection in action. We are looking at natural selection in the environment. What I'm looking for is to pick out examples of natural selection among living organisms. So I'll be randomly selecting some organisms that lived millions of years ago to explain what we mean by natural selection. Before we go on, I would like you to go through these vocabulary words at your spare time using your dictionary or an online search to help you understand more. So, our environment is our life, and our environment consists of a lot of living things, including plants and animals. Like in this example you see here, there can be lots and loads of plants and animals that interact in this environment. So, how does natural selection happen in our environment? This leads us to the definition. Natural selection is simply the process through which nature allows certain organisms to live in their habitat, and it relates to their life, to their behavior, to their structural adaptation, and also to their physiological and functional adaptation in such a habitat or environment. Now, this is a typical example of a particular animal that lived millions of years ago. Is called the Archicebus achilis. The Archicebus achilis. It was a known insectivorous mammal that feeds on insects millions of years ago. And after some time, the law of nature actually fizzled them out, like they died and went extinct. But we can trace them using their fossil record, as seen in the next slide. Now, in 2013, the fossil of a tiny insect-eating animal, Archicebus achilis, which lived about 55 million years ago in our environment, was seen on this rock. The fossil formation of an evolutionary history about this particular animal and how nature has selected it to be alive at some point, and at some point it is no longer alive. Also, I'll take you to example using plants. Now, in this plant, these are bean plants that are crowded in one position. Now, for these plants to survive, they all require water, they all require nutrient from the soil, they all require air, warmth, and they compete for space. So, for them to stay alive, we need to probably split them into parts and replant or transplant them. But leaving them in this crowded condition, some of them might not be able to compete for these requirements for life and might easily die out or wither away. So only the survival of the fittest can recur here, where only few will survive this crowdedness. Also, I'm looking at another example. Here we have the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs once roamed the world millions of years ago, but at some point they've gone into extinction. That is the law of natural selection. At some point, nature allowed them to live or thrive in the environment. Most of them were carnivorous as they feed on other animals, but there was a problem of respiration and circulatory problem. They grew so big that these systems can no longer support them, and they began to die out. And also, a theory also told it that there was a release of meteors from space that fell violently on Earth where these dinosaurs live, and most of them died out, leading to their extinction gradually until we don't longer have them in existence. So that is a law of natural selection. Plants die, animals die, but while they are alive, what are their activities? What are their adaptations to stay alive in their physical environment? So as you can see in this slide, this is an aquatic habitat that has the starfish, the seaweeds, and a coral reef around. Now, natural selection will tend to allow some particular organisms here to live longer than the other. It all depends on how they compete for food, for space, and for other natural resources to stay alive. Also, these are polyps. This is a hydra plant. This is a sponge plant, and this is a fish. The fish hides in between them as a means of shelter. And if predators tend to feed more on this fish, at some point they might migrate or even go extinct. That is a law of natural selection. Okay, moving on to the polyps. We call these organisms polyps. Polyps because of their body structure. Most of them have a cylindrical body structure. So here I have a hydra plant. It's called hydra. And here I have a sponge. We call this organism or animal a sponge. Then this is a fish that tends to find shelter amongst these polyps or the hydra and the sponges. Now, in this environment, this is an aquatic environment where we have a fish, and the fish goes about its daily or routine activities in search of food in form of diatoms and other phytoplanktons in the aquatic environment. But in turn, it has some predators that predate on it or that search for it as a means of food. So in the long run, you might discover that this fish will be hunted by other predators, or what I call the fish enemies. And if this hunting or predatorship continues over time, or there's continuous feeding on this particular species of fish, they might eventually reduce in population or eventually go extinct, as the case may be. But if they so have it, they might migrate to other parts of the ocean in order to stay safe from their predators. So in that case, the law of natural selection will set in one way or the other, either by predators feeding on them regularly or dying naturally, or in the event of a disease outbreak, they might eventually die out, and natural selection has taken place. This is another example of natural selection. This is a particular bird, a hummingbird, and it has made its nest on the branch of a tree. Now it is doing this to serve as shelter and for safety for it and its young ones. Now, there are natural predators of birds that tends to feed on birds. Other bigger birds tends to feed on the smaller birds, or you have other animals that feed on habitats. It is discovered that over time, when predators continue to hunt around here, this bird might no longer be safe in this nest. So it gives room for it to either migrate to stay alive or prey upon. And when it's preyed upon, the law of natural selection has taken place. So also there's this rule of life in the habitat. We call it the three C's in life. Every organism has a choice to make, that is to say, in terms of adaptation, and what kind of adaptation: behavioral adaptation, functional adaptation, and also structural adaptation in order to stay alive. Then the chances has to do with how well they can be able to adapt for feeding, how they can be able to migrate in terms of danger or in response to unfavorable weather condition. Then change in the environment has to do with seasonal changes. So how organisms respond to this depends on how long they will stay in an environment. So this brings me to the end of this lesson. I'd like to recap by saying the law of natural selection has to do with the chances of an organism to survive in its immediate habitat. Feature or special defensive mechanism they employ to stay alive. When this is not employed the right way, they might eventually lose track and go extinct. So for me, it is bye from all of us at GAA Online Support. Hope to see you in my next segment. Bye. Thank you.